Hey guys, tonight we're going on a very specific kind of journey. You're about to become an 18th century sailor, and no, not the romantic, sea-shanty-singing kind. We're talking about the real deal, splinters in every surface, the constant smell of fish and sweat, and a very personal mystery that you'll be solving pretty quickly. Where does one do their business? It's okay. You can admit it. You've probably never thought too deeply about toilet logistics on a wooden warship. That's fine. Most people haven't. But once you step onto that creaking deck, in your stiff wool trousers and salt-stained boots, it's suddenly the most urgent question in your life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, leave a comment with your city and what time it is as you're listening. I always love seeing where and when these stories are finding you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel this ship before you even see it. It groans against the dock like some ancient, half-asleep beast. The wooden planks beneath your feet creak as you haul your bundle of clothes and salted beef up the gangplank. The smell hits you. Nectar, old rope, moldy canvas, and something a bit less definable, kind of sour, kind of sharp. Let's just say it's a smell you'll befriend, whether you want to or not. This is your first voyage. You've signed on for a transatlantic trip, and you're not sure what exactly you're getting into. The ship is called the Thornback, which sounds vaguely threatening, like it might turn on you in your sleep. Still, the captain seemed mostly sober when you met him, which puts him in the top 10% of all captains. Probably, you're issued a hammock, a mast in, and exactly zero instructions about where to go when nature calls. You figure you'll ask someone later, maybe Jenkins, that guy with only one eyebrow and 5 teeth. He looks experienced. As you stow your gear, you notice the tight quarters. You're crammed in with down scenes of other sailors, all smelling like various types of brine. The hammocks sway above barrels of salted cod and powder kegs. There are no doors, no corners, not even a blessed privacy curtain. If modesty is something you value, now's a good time to let it go. You spot a small bucket under the stairs. Maybe that's it. You ask Jenkins. He laughs loudly. That's for puke, not poop, he says, smacking your back hard enough to move your spine an inch. Wait till you see the head. The head, as it turns out, is sailor slang for the very front of the ship's bow. Why? Because in earlier times, ships didn't have indoor plumbing, obviously, and the bow juts out over the water. Wind blows from back to front, which means that if you relieve yourself up front, the stink gets carried away from the ship. Smart, right? Except, of course, when the wind changes direction, or the ship turns, or waves splash back, you take a cautious stroll up to the bow, and yep, there it is. 2 little holes cut into a wooden plank, suspended right above the ocean, with nothing between you and the crashing sea but your own trembling thigh muscles. There's no railing, no rope, no warning sign that says, "Caution, but at risk." Just you, the sea, and your sudden appreciation for land-based bathrooms. There are stories, whispered late at night, of green recruits falling straight through those holes during a storm. One minute you're doing your business, the next minute splash gone. The sea doesn't ask questions. Jenkins says that's why you always hold the rope that runs along the side. He grins and adds, "You'll figure it out, or you won't. Either way, we'll be lighter." It's about this time you realize there's no toilet paper, not even leaves, not even bad leaves. You're not sure what you expected, but this wasn't it. Still, the sea calls, and not in the poetic way. You walk back to your hammock, suddenly hyper-aware of your body's schedule. Tomorrow, you find out what they actually use. But for now, you just lie back, sway with the ship, and hope for a miracle or a very low-fiber diet. And yes, just in case you're wondering, historians do debate whether sailors in different navies had different habits, or whether some just learned it to hold it until land. Spoiler, they didn't. Nobody's that strong. The next morning, you wake to the gentle creak of wood and the less gentle shouting of bosuns. There's already a squabble happening. 3 hammocks down, something about someone stealing someone else's biscuit, which may or may not have had weevils. You're still groggy, still unsure whether you dreamt that toilet situation at the bow, but the soreness in your thighs confirms. No, you did not. Breakfast is served on deck. Salt pork, hardtack, and a mug of something warmish. You chew thoughtfully, mostly because the biscuit requires a good 30 chews before it becomes swallowable. As you eat, you glance forward to the head. It's occupied. Jenkins waves at you from it, trousers around ankles, as if it's the most normal thing in the world, which, apparently, it is. You decide it's time to ask someone, not Jenkins, someone with more empathy. That ends up being old Thomas, the sailmaker. He's been on ships longer than you've been alive and smells faintly of pine tar and something minty. Maybe chewing herbs or rum could go either way. So, you ask, keeping your voice low, how does one clean up afterward? Thomas looks at you, blinks slowly, then chuckles like a man who has heard this question 100 times. He says, you've discovered the ghost in the ship. Have ye? You stare, the missing paper. He clarifies, tapping his nose like it's some kind of sailor riddle. We don't use it, not unless you're an officers with access to writing. Scrap switch, mind you, are rarer than gold. He leans in, lowering his voice as if telling you a trade secret. You've got a few options, none of them nice, but they work. Option 1, the sea sponge. Now, this one actually dates back to the Romans and continued, in some fashion, through maritime history. Sailors would tie a sponge to a rope, lower it overboard, swish it clean in the salt water, and well, you know, afterwards, it got rinsed and reused by everyone. That's right, communal sponge. Jenkins called it the friendship loop. You try not to gag. Option 2, tow rack. You heard this one whispered last night. It's essentially a bit of old cloth, often tied to a string and tossed over the side after use. The motion of the waves helps clean it off. You then haul it back up for the next person. Reusable and efficient. Thomas says, if you don't think about it too much. Option 3, old sailcloth. Rough, but available. Sailmakers like Thomas often had scraps that were too damaged for patching. These were considered luxury, the rich man's rag, but sailcloth had the consistency of sandpaper, and after a few uses, well, things got sore fast. There's also the occasional dry grass, moss, or smooth seaweed if you happen to be near a shore, which you're not. By the way, you're currently 112 miles from the nearest landmass, and the closest thing to moss is the green fuzz growing near the barrels. You ask about paper again. Too valuable. Thomas shrugs. We use it for logs, charts, and bagging letters to the Admiralty, never for bumps. He gives you a knowing look and says, back home, I had a privy with a torn-up copy of the Royal Gazette nailed next to it. On a ship, you take what you can get. Once, I saw a lad use a fish. You stare. Didn't go well? He adds, slippery little bugger. You laugh, but also, you're deeply alarmed. The sea makes you creative or desperate, sometimes both. And while maritime museums and naval textbooks often gloss over this aspect of sailor life, historians do acknowledge its importance. Hygiene on long voyages was a key issue not just for comfort, but for survival. One case of dysentery could spread faster than went through sails. Modern scholars still debate whether navies had official policies on post-defecation practices. Some ships carried sponges, others relied entirely on crew innovation. Most likely, it varied ship to ship, just like your current situation. You've got a rope, a rag, and a rising sense of dread. Later that afternoon, you're assigned head watch. Not as fancy as it sounds. It means making sure no one falls through the hole during rough seas. And if someone does, well, you shout, maybe throw a rope, probably just update the ship's roster. As the sun begins to dip, painting the water gold, Jenkins strolls by with a smug look. You'll get used to it, he says. One day, you'll miss that rag. You very much doubt that, but who knows? Give it a few weeks, maybe you'll even name it. By day 3, you've accepted a few hard truths. Your hammock will never feel quite dry. Your socks will never smell quite right again. And privacy is a luxury best left to land. But there's another, more immediate problem that reveals itself just after breakfast. Everything on this ship is damp. Your shirt, Damp. Your bread? Slightly damp. Even your towel when you had one isn't drying. Because nothing dries out here. The air itself feels like it's been soaked in a bucket overnight. And so, naturally, when you trudge toward the head, after a particularly suspicious bowl of pea stew, you realize the last thing you want near your bare skin right now is damp rope. There it is, swaying gently in the salty breeze. The communal tow rag, soaked not just by the sea, but likely by 1,000 regrets. You crouch, hesitate, and just stare at it. You're not alone in your discomfort. In fact, dampness was one of the most constant enemies of the 18th century sailor. The ocean wasn't content to stay beneath the ship. It insisted on climbing aboard through every crack, crevice, and ensued plank. Sailors often walked ankle-deep in water after storms. Some just gave up and went barefoot full-time. You're beginning to understand why. Your trousers clean in all the wrong places. Your undershirt is starting to grow what might be mold. And your bedding, let's just say, is developing a personality of its own. So how does this relate to hygiene? Oh, in every possible way. Damp environments are breeding grounds for bacteria, and when you're working 12-hour shifts hauling mines, climbing rigging, and manning the sails, there's not much time to air out, dry off, or, well, scrub. Add to that the fact that the cleaning implements, towel rags, sea sponges, and the like, you are often left hanging off the side of the ship, constantly wet and rarely washed in fresh water. You do the math. By mid-morning, you're starting to itch. You're not alone. Jenkins scratches. Thomas scratches. Even the ship's cat scratches and probably judges you while doing it. The itches begin to feel suspiciously coordinated. A rat scurries by. It scratches, too. For a moment, there's a strange unity across species. You ask Thomas if this is normal. Oh sure, he says. Casual as ever. Bit of chafing. Bit of salt rash. Bit of the creeping itch. You ask him to clarify the creeping itch. He does not. What he does mention is that sailors developed various strategies to cope. Some, like Jenkins, took to hang their wrecks in the sun during breaks, hoping for a bit of dryness. Others requested extra scraps of sailcloth to cycle between uses, though that was only if you caught the sailmaster in a generous mood. Some experimented with rubbing fine sand or ash as a kind of makeshift drying agent. That sounds painful, and it was, but apparently less painful than trench trot of the behind. You start to appreciate just how much effort went into not falling apart. And then there's the sea itself. Salt water might seem like a disinfectant, and to a degree, it can be. But when your skin is already raw, the salt stings worse than any punishment from the boss one. Plus, frequent dunking in the cold Atlantic doesn't exactly improve morale. You don't have showers, you have storms, and nobody wants to bathe during a gale. A few particularly inventive sailors, Thomas tells you, started creating makeshift privacy cloaks. Old sails hung like little curtains at the bows so they could at least tend to themselves without an audience. These usually lasted about a day before someone tripped over them, cursed, and tossed the whole thing overboard. Academics still debate whether sailors' chronic dampness contributed directly to the many infections and outbreaks on board. The ship's surgeon, if you were lucky enough to have one, might jot down notes like irritation in the lower regions or redness of the posterior folds. Charming, isn't it? At one point, Jenkins swears the French Navy had a better system. They used their socks. He says solemnly. You look down at your own socks and shudder. That's why I go barefoot. He grins. The thing is, by the end of your first week at sea, your standards have changed. You no longer recoil at the sight of the tow rag. You start evaluating as dampness like a baker checks dough. Not bad today. You mutter, could be worse. The ocean has a way of lowering expectations, but also, weirdly, bonding people. You and your crewmates now share everything. Space, smells, storms, and yes, that rope. By evening, the age has settled into a dull annoyance, and the sunset paints the deck in golds and oranges. It's almost beautiful, almost enough to forget the fact that your trousers are now permanently fused to your thighs. Almost. By now, you've stopped asking when things will get better. They won't, but they do get weirder. Your body starts to adjust to the rhythms of the ship, the slow rock, the slap of waves against the hull, the creak of rigging above, but your mind, that's still catching up, especially when you discover just how creative sailors could be when faced with the eternal question of what do I wipe with. This particular morning, a light drizzle taps gently on the deck, the kind of weather that makes your socks feel like sea cucumbers. You trudge toward the bow again and pass by Jenkins, who is very proudly holding what looks like kelp. It's fresh. He beams. Got it tangled in that anchor rope. You blink. You're going to use that. Better than the rope. He shrugs. Smoother. Nature's own velvet. Really? You make a note never to borrow anything from Jenkins ever again. But he's not wrong. Seaweed was a thing, certain, kind straws, flat, cool or favored if you were lucky enough to snag some near a coastline. Was it a little slippery? Sure. Was it full of tiny ocean critters? Maybe, but it was soft and available, which met the only two criteria that mattered. Then there was sailcloth. Rough, frayed pieces of canvas left over from repairs were a popular option among the more seasoned crew who had long since given up on preserving their dignity or skin. It wasn't about comfort, it was about reliability. You knew what you were getting with sailcloth. A thorough job, a stunning finish, and the minor thrill of gambling with splinters. Even rope scraps made the list, particularly old manila or hemp ropes that had been softened by years of use. Sailors would fray the ends, creating a kind of nautical feather duster. Charming? No, unless, of course, you picked the wrong end. One sailor even tried using a mitten. Just the one. It was never seen again. You start to notice a certain hierarchy among the crew based on wiping preferences. Jenkins is proudly in the seaweed camp. Thomas swears by toe rags. A guy named Little, Joho, is neither little nor named. Joe only uses leftover cloth from the surgeon's bandage bin. Nobody asks him too many questions. Even the officers, those polished, white-gloved men with clean-shaven chins, weren't entirely exempt. Sure, they had better quarters and access to slightly more refined materials like old navigational drafts, letters from home they no longer needed, or the occasional newspaper from 6 months ago. But when you're mid-ocean, out of paper, and desperate, even Captain Lambert probably eyeballed the curtains once or twice. Speaking of paper, let's talk about just how rare it was. Paper was expensive, often imported, and carefully rationed. Most of it went toward logs, accounting, or maintaining communications. You didn't just tear a page out of the captain's diary to solve a personal crisis. Well, not unless you were planning to swim home. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether certain navies ever officially provided personal hygiene materials. Some records hint that high-ranking ships might have stocked something akin to personal rags, but the majority of sailors, they improvised wildly. Your first attempt at innovation happens on day 7. You spot an old polishing cloth tucked behind a barrel for brass, stained with something you can't quite identify. In a moment of desperation, you repurpose it. Is it ideal? Absolutely not. But is it better than Jenkins seaweed? Well, you'll get back to me on that. Later that day, a storm rolls in, and suddenly you're clinging to the side of the ship with one hand and gripping the tow rack with the other, praying to every deity you've ever heard of. The waves smash the hull. Salt sprays your face. The rope tugs silently as the ship rolls. You realize, in this moment of soggy reflection, that sailors were less warriors and more survivors of a very specific, very damp battlefield. That evening, Thomas tells you a story. Back in 42, he begins, rocking on his heels. A lad used an old map to wipe. Thought it was scrap. Turned out to be our backup chart to the West Indies. You ask what happened? Well, he says, we missed the Indies entirely. Ended up in Boston. There's a moment of silence. Great chowder. Though, he adds, you don't know what's more amazing. The idea that a single poor wiping decision rerouted a voyage, or the fact that no one seemed too upset about it. At this point, you're starting to feel like you've joined a secret club. Not an elegant one, not one you brag about, but one built on shared suffering, resourcefulness, and a very strange kind of humor. You look up at the stars that night, rocking gently in your hammock, and whisper thanks to the heavens. But to whoever thought of that rag on a rope, you're still not happy about it. But You get it now. You wake up today with one mission. Figure out how Neptune's named people actually managed to use that rope without flinging themselves into the Atlantic. Because here's the thing, no one really teaches you how to use it. There's no illustrated guide titled Tow Rag Techniques for Beginners. No helpful signage like, insert backside here. Just a damn fraying rope, your own questionable instincts, and the ever-present risk of flashing passing dolphins. So you observe. You wait nearby the head, pretending to inspect a coil of rope that doesn't need inspecting. Jenkins strolls up first, humming a sea shanty that's probably about fish romance. With one smooth motion, he crouches, grabs the hanging tow rag, does his business, gives it a lazy dip in the sea, and slaps it back over the side like a man tossing his laundry into the wind. Efficiency, 10/10. Elegance, 0.5. Later, little Joe approaches. He doesn't crouch. He leans, more of a hover. Really, a kind of strategic balancing act between gravity, muscle memory, and the fear of becoming fish food. He uses the rope like a pulley system, gripping one end, pulling taut, swiping with the other. Honestly, it's kind of impressive. Like rope ballet. You clap softly. He doesn't notice. Then it's your turn. You take a breath, step forward, knees slightly bent, eyes darting like you're entering a gladiator arena. One hand on the ship's edge, the other gripping the rag, which ice of course are colder than expected. You try not to think about how many people used this today, or yesterday, or ever. The ship sways. You sway with it. Your thighs burn with effort. The rope slips. You yelp. A seagull cackles in the distance. Eventually, through sheer willpower and a profound lack of options, you succeed, and not just in the physical act of succeeding crossing a mental line. You're no longer new. You've been baptized in the sacred waters of nautical humiliation. You're one of them. Thomas notices your triumphant return and nods solemnly. You made it, he says. You're now part of the Brotherhood of the Bow. You ask if that's a real thing. No, he says, but it should be. The more you talk to the crew, the more you realize that each person has their own system. Jenkins times his visits with the tide, so the splash from the rope is just right. Another sailor, Teat, swears by spinning the rag in a small loop before using it, claims it increases coverage. And some old-timers say you should always hum while going, so people know you're still up there and haven't fallen through the hole. It's kind of beautiful in a gross, salty, extremely unhygienic way. Even the terminology has its own charm. The rope isn't just the rope, it's called the devil's tail, or the ringer, or, if you're in a poetic mood, Poseidon's handshake. There's even an old superstition. If you drop the rope and let it trail behind without tying it off, it'll curse the ship with windless days. Is there historical evidence for this? None whatsoever. But try telling that to Jenkins when it catches you letting the rope dangle too long. Interestingly, historians are still arguing over whether the tow rag was a British invention or something sailors all over Europe developed independently. Some old French naval documents mention le chiffon marin, or the sailor's cloth, while certain Dutch captains reportedly prefer bundles of mulls kept in sealed barrels. The only thing consistent across nations. No one wanted to talk about it too much in their memoirs, which makes sense. You wouldn't want your great-grandkids reading about how you once lost grip of a rope mid-wipe and landed face first in the drink. But here's a fun academic tidbit. One maritime historian found evidence that the Royal Navy tried to standardize hygiene practices during the late 18th century. Not for comfort. Of course, a comfort was a luxury for poets and Frenchmen, but to reduce disease. Apparently, a few ships even assigned a junior sailor to monitor the cleanliness of the tow rag. You ask Thomas if this ever happened on the Thorndyke. Oh, aye, he says, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of jerky. That was Squeaky Tom's job last voyage. You ask what happened to Squeaky Tom. Stopped squeaking, Thomas says, and walks away. You decide not to follow up. That night, as you sit beneath a sky full of stars, you feel oddly at peace. Maybe it's the salt air. Maybe it's the quiet groan of the ship's wood, or the sound of the waves gently lapping below. Or maybe it's just the satisfaction of mastering something most people in your century will never even think about. You've survived the rope, and you've earned your sea legs and your sea wipes. By now, you've probably guessed that the humble rope isn't just some random piece of ship gear thrown in for convenience. It has a name, a purpose, and dare I say, a kind of status on board. The sailors call it the tow rag, and it's about as beloved as a porcupine in your hammock. This isn't just a rag on a string, it's a multifunctional tool that's seen more action than the ship's anchor. You'll find it hanging just beneath the bow, ready for the next brave soul to face the cold ocean breeze and the risks of the head. Some sailors even say it's a symbol of camaraderie after all. Everyone uses it, whether they like it or not. The tow rag is made from coarse hemp or sometimes cotton cloth, tied to a rope long enough to be dumped into the sea, rinsed, and pulled back up. Simple, right? But there's an art to its use. You need to make sure it's properly secured, so it doesn't slip out and get lost to the deep. Losing the tow rag means you're out of luck and it's a long swim if you decide to retrieve it yourself. Here's a fun, little-known fact. Some sailors took to personalizing their tow rags. They'd mark them with bits of colored thread or weave in small knots to distinguish theirs from the communal mess. Of course, whether this actually helped or just caused confusion is anyone's guess. Thomas tells you that the tow rag wasn't just for wiping. On longer voyages, the damp rag could double as a cleaning cloth for gear, or even as a makeshift bandage in emergencies. It was that versatile. You start to see why sailors treated it with a mix of respect and mild disgust. As you watch Jenkins preparing for his turn, you notice the ritual. He carefully undoes the tow rag, dips it in the sea, gives it a firm twist, then very deliberately flings it up and over the side to dry. It's almost theatrical. You wonder if there's an unspoken code governing how fast you can whip it without causing a splashback. Interestingly, historians debate whether the practice of using a tow rag originated purely from necessity or if it evolved from earlier Roman sponge-on-a-stick traditions. Some argue that the saltwater rinsing technique was a maritime innovation that helped reduce infections on cramped ships, while others suggest it was simply a gross shortcut born from the lack of alternatives. One of the more curious sailor stories you hear involves a captain who once declared a tow rag day a rare moment when the entire crew was ordered to replace their rags and properly clean the head area. It was reportedly the only day the ship smelled remotely bearable for a week. Unfortunately, no one was keen on repeating it, since it involved a full day of close-quarters cleaning and a lot of uncomfortable questions about personal hygiene. The tow rag even inspired a few superstitions. Dropping it overboard without tying it off could supposedly anger the sea gods and bring bad weather. Leaving it dry for too long was said to invite the itch, a skin condition sailors swore was caused by cursed cloth. You smile, realizing how much sailors needed a bit of folklore to survive their day-to-day grind. That night, you find yourself strangely attached to the tow rag. It's become a weird kind of talisman, a symbol of your passage from landlubber to sailor, from ignorant to seasoned. Sure, it's wet, rough, and smells faintly of salt and regret, but it's yours now. And tomorrow, you're told you might get to try one made from wool supposedly softer, though equally effective. In the meantime, you'll cling to your new rope friend and the small comfort it brings on this endless sea. By now, you've accepted that your dignity was probably left behind somewhere on the dock before you ever boarded this ship. And that's okay, because today, you learned something that truly tests your understanding of what shared suffering means. The tow rag, it's not just a group activity in theory. It's literally communal. That's right, everyone uses it. The same rope, the same rag, sometimes the same knot in the same spot. You're not sure whether to be horrified or oddly impressed by the level of trust that implies. You bring this up with Jenkins, who's casually oiling a harpoon with one hand and scratching his back with a fork in the other. So, you say carefully, "We don't each get our own." He looks at you like you just asked if the moon was made of cheese. On what? He says, "A personal tow rag you offer." Voice shrinking, he bursts out laughing, nearly dropping the fork. "Oh, lad, you sweet summer biscuit, that's not how this works. This is a team sport. A team sport is one way to put it. Another might be rotating hygiene roulette. Apparently, on most ships, the idea of individual cleaning materials was considered laughably extravagant. You shared everything else: food, space, sleep, fart, so why not this? 2. There was usually just one rag hanging off the bow, and if you were lucky, someone remembered to rinse it occasionally. Maybe you asked Thomas if there were ever issues. Like sanitary issues. He blinks. Lad, we lived with rats bigger than your arm and drank rainwater that smelled like shoe leather. A rag was the least of our problems. Fair point. Still, there were unspoken rules. For instance, don't use the rag during a storm unless absolutely necessary. You will lose it or yourself. If the rag falls into the sea, you must fish it out, even if you don't want to, especially if you were the one who dropped it. Always rinse after use. Not everyone did, mind you, but it was considered basic decency, like not whistling during meals or stepping on someone's shadow. But of course, not all sailors were so communal-minded. You hear rumors of one midshipman who hoarded a small stash of personal cloth scraps and refused to share. They called him Silkenweir, and his life was a lonely one, ostracized, mysterious, probably clean. No one's really sure what happened to him. Some sailors took creative liberties. One tied multiple rags to the rope, like a string of nautical flags. He called it the parade. Another stitched initials into his favorite rag corner. There were even tow rag. Disputous arguments over whether someone had used the good part and left only the damp, fraying edge. One afternoon, during a lull in duties, you gather with a few mates and watch as a fresh recruit approaches the head. He looks nervous. He skins the rope. Unsure, he glances back at the crew, some smirking, others pretending not to watch. It's a rite of passage. He uses the rag poorly, but he survives. And when he returns, Jenkins claps him on the back, like a father welcoming a son home from war. You've done it, he says. You're one of us now, and also, you might want to rinse again. From an academic perspective, this whole setup was complicated. There's little concrete documentation about daily hygiene routines among sailors, but what's clear is that practicality trumped comfort in nearly every case. Paper was scarce, cloth was reused, and the sea was the only constant cleaner. Historians argue whether this kind of shared rag use actually helped build morale. Some say it was a necessary evil. Others argue it created a strange bond that only those at sea could understand. You start to believe the latter, because something strange happens after the shared moment at the bow. You feel a little more connected, a little more seasoned, a little more salty. Perhaps you're not just surviving out here, you're adapting. You're learning the ways of the ship, and that includes the rag. As the day winds down and the sun dips below the horizon, casting the sails in warm amber, you think about all the things you used to find horrifying. Now, they're just part of the routine. Sure, it's gross, but it's your kind of gross now, and in the great maritime tradition of making do. You're doing just fine. You think you've seen it all by now. You've clung to a rag in a storm, stared down seaweed with suspicion, and learned to accept that the ocean has absolutely zero respect for your personal space. But today, something changes. Today, you meet the officer's latrine. Now, don't get too excited. It's not some golden throne tucked behind a velvet curtain. It's still a glorified hole above the sea, but it's separated, partitioned off, shielded from public view by an actual door. A creaky, splintery door. Sure, but a door nonetheless. You stare at it like a man peering through the gates of Eden. You were sent on a message, one carrying a note to the first lieutenant about the biscuit shortage, which, either way, is starting to look like sabotage. That's when you catch a glimpse of it, tucked just behind the quarterdeck, beside the officer's mess, a tiny cubby-like space, with a clean-looking bench and, is that paper? No, not real paper, but scrap, torn corners of old maps, faded naval memos, even a pamphlet about scurvy prevention. You blink, you've been wiping with wet rope, and they have. Literature. You return to the lower deck with 1,000 questions and exactly 0 answers. So, naturally, you ask Thomas, he says, not even looking up from his stitching. You found the captain's privy. You ask why it's so fancy. Well, Thomas says, officers don't share quarters, don't share rations, and they certainly don't share rags. This is enlightening and deeply unfair. Turns out, the officers' facilities, while not exactly luxurious, did get certain upgrades. Paper scraps, a bit more privacy, and sometimes even a little jug of fresh water for rinsing. They weren't immune to the ship's motion, or the spray, or the smell, but they had a bit more control, which, in a world where control is about as rare as dry socks, means everything. You ask if any sailors ever snuck in to use it. Thomas gives you a look. Only once. He came out with a broken nose and 2 weeks of extra duty. Got caught using the captain's towel. They have towels. Don't ask. This kind of division wasn't just about comfort. It was about rank. In the Royal Navy and most navies of the 18th century, status defined everything. Your meals, your bedding, your tasks, and yes, your toilet experience. Officers had servants to launder their cloths and clean their quarters. You, on the other hand, had Jenkins, a shared hammock, and an ocean that wanted to eat your pants. But here's the kicker. Even with those privileges, the officers still got sick. Scurvy didn't care about your rank, nor did dysentery, or the dreaded bloody flux. There are records of captains curled over chamber pots, while their crews forged ahead. One surgeon's log from 1790 to describes an admiral reduced to rags and moaning with great frequency. So much for command, but let's return to the paper. It was, in many ways, the ultimate luxury at sea, not just because it was rare, but because it could burn. And in the cold, damp world of a ship, that made it doubly valuable. Crewmates sometimes begged the surgeon for old charts, or supply logs, anything with words on it and no longer useful. One sailor tells you in hushed tones that he once wiped with a letter from his ex. Never felt more closure, he says. But paper was also a status symbol. Using it for toilet needs meant you were high enough up the ladder to have access to it in the first place. You never admit it out loud, but when you saw that torn-up map under the officer's bench, a tiny part of you thought, someday, not that you'd trade the camaraderie of the main deck for a silent solo wipe. There's something weirdly comforting about yelling heads free and hearing a dowsing muttered "thank God's" in reply. Still, you now walk past the quarterdeck with a slightly different look in your eye, a knowing glance, a quiet dream. One day, maybe, you'll be trusted with paper or a curtain, or, dare you imagine it, both. Until then, you return to your rope, frayed, salty, faithful, because the rack may not have status, but it has stories. There's a rhythm to ship life now. Eat, work, scrub something, curse the weevils, wipe with the rope, repeat. You don't even flinch anymore when Jenkins whistles his tow ragton on his way to the bow. You've joined the ranks of the truly broken in a sailor, who no longer dreams of porcelain or plumbing, but instead of a slightly less damp corner of cloth. But today, things get philosophical. It starts with Lil Joe. He's leaning on the rail, watching the endless gray horizon, eating what might be his fourth hardtack of the day. You're nearby, minding your own business, when he turns to you and says, "You ever think about how much history's been wiped away?" You blink, like, metaphorically. "No," he says, "like literally. With our racks, old maps, memos, pages from logs. History's got a backside, too." You pause, and then you kind of get it, because when paper is rare, and cloth is reused, and no one really cares what's printed on something, when they're desperate, he turns out a lot of the past gets recycled through sailors' rear ends. Thomas joins the conversation and nods gravely. "I once saw a man use a piece of a treaty," he says. "Portuguese. I recognize the seal." You ask what happened to the rest of the treaty. "Probably dissolved in the Bay of Biscay." Thomas replies, "That's the kind of fact you won't find in a textbook." It turns out that wiping wasn't just a necessity, it was a quiet act of erasure. Leftover manifests, maps that were no longer accurate, even outdated Ordersil eventually ended up doing a final, rather undignified service. When they were no longer useful above deck, they were put to work below it. A few sailors even claimed to have wiped with part of a sermon. "Too much guilt in the ink," one said. You ask if there was ever a system for choosing which documents got demoted to rag duty. Sure, Thomas says, it's called, What Can I Reach When I Need It Most? Which makes sense, because when nature calls and the sea's rolling, and Jenkins is knocking on the wall yelling hurry it up, you don't exactly conduct a paper review. Interestingly, some historians have studied the sanitation trail of naval ships through the fragments they left behind bits apart and discovered decades later in shipwrecks, partially readable but suspiciously smudged. One scholar even theorized that we've lost portions of 18th century correspondence because the midshipmen assigned to transcribe them needed a backup plan during a stormy night. And what's worse, the officers probably did the same thing. Only difference is, they might have wiped with your letters. One sailor swears he saw a lieutenant tearing up a love letter from his wife, only to toss it into the officer's privy a moment later. Never heard from her again. He said, with a kind of half-joke that makes you wonder, there's something both hilarious and tragic about it. All these messages, maps, even family, trees gone, not to fire, not to war, but to the backside of maritime progress. You wonder what archaeologists in the year 3000 will think when they pull a damn degraded contract from a sunken brig and read the first legible word, Dear Sir, followed by a long, brownish smear. Will they think it was censorship, a protest, or just Jenkins having a particularly rough lunch that day? But that's the sea for you. It strips things down. The fancy writing, the noble declarations, the elegant prosody all crumble when met with a salt-crusted rope and a time crunch. What survives isn't what was most beautiful, it's what was least useful. As the sky turns pink over the horizon and the deck quiets for the night, you find yourself strangely reflective. Maybe every sailor becomes a kind of historian not because they preserve the past, but because they lived through the parts no one writes about, the parts that dissolve or get flushed out to sea. You wrap your coat tighter and glance toward the bow. The rope sways softly in the wind, and somewhere, probably, history weeps. You've been at sea long enough now to know three things for certain. The biscuits will always be still. Jenkins will always whistle off key. And if you see a wreck with a suspicious steer, don't ask what happened. Today, though, you learn something new, something you didn't think was possible. There are people who voluntarily take the job of cleaning the tow rag. That's right, somewhere between scrubbing the deck and mending torn sails lies one of the least glamorous, most quietly heroic tasks aboard, rag maintenance. The rag doesn't just clean you, you have to clean it, too. Now, you might assume that no one wants this job, that it's a punishment reserved for insubordination, like mop duty or scrubbing the bilge. And sometimes, sure it is, but more often than not, it gets rotated among the lower-ranking sailors, which is how, naturally, it ends up on your chore list today. You're handed a bucket, a length of twine, and what can only be described as a lifeless, sea-soaked towel with a 1,000-yard stare. Give her a good rinse, the boatswain grunts, as if talking about a horse instead of a hygiene horror story. So off you go to the side of the ship, tipping the rag into the ocean over and over, squeezing and twisting, your hands quickly going numb from the salt and cold. It smells like brine and mildew, and maybe a distant memory of someone's cabbage dinner from last week. You're trying to take it seriously, really, but Jenkins comes by, leans on the rail, and deadpans. You missed a spot. You respond with the only weapon available, flinging a tiny splash of dirty water in his direction. He ducks, laughing. Don't get too attached. That wreck's been around longer than half the crew, which, as it turns out, might not be a joke. There's this strange, unspoken mythology around old rags. Some are lucky, others are haunted. One is supposedly made from a torn-up officer's coat after a mutiny, though no one can agree which mutiny, or which officers, or why anyone would want to reuse that cloth. You scrub, and wring, and scrub again. You tie it back onto the rope, nice and tight, like you've seen the veterans do. Then you step back and look at your work, and you realize you kind of care, not because you've suddenly fallen in love with sanitation duties, but because this little piece of cloth has been part of your journey. It was there when you slipped on day 3, there, when Jenkins told you about Poseidon's handshake. There when Thomas made you laugh so hard you almost fell through the hole. It's gross, but it's also, weirdly, comforting. You're not the only one who feels this way. That evening, over a mug of weevil tea, don't ask, you hear some of the older sailors reminiscing about their favorite wrecks. One claims his last ship had a wreck with a name, Betsy. Another insists that rubbing the wreck clockwise 3 times before using it brought good luck during storms. Total nonsense. Thomas says, "Still did it though, didn't you?" Jenkins shoots back. There's a kind of reverence in their banter, not for the wreck itself, but for what it represents: endurance, adaptation, and the strange traditions that bloom in the absence of plumbing. Historians rarely mention this part of ship life. Sanitation gets a footnote, maybe a dry paragraph about hygiene standards, but you're starting to think they miss the point. The tow rack isn't just a tool, it's an experience. It's a rite. It's a soggy, flapping badge of honor. Some records from the era describe designated rag duty as one of the least desirable but most vital jobs on board. Ships without a system, without someone responsible for cleaning and maintaining the rag, often saw a rise in infections, rashes, and outright rebellion. It turns out that something as simple as a clean cloth could make or break morale. So yeah, you clean it, because even though it'll be dirty again tomorrow, you're part of a long, itchy, uncomfortable lineage of sailors who did the same. And tonight, as the stars wheel overhead and the wind whistles through the rigging, you watch the newly scrubbed rag flap gently in the breeze, like a tiny, tattered flag of survival. Long may it wave. By now, you've developed an almost meditative relationship with the act of heading to the bow. Not because you enjoy it, let's be clear. You don't, but because there's something reassuring about routine. You've come to terms with the cold rope, the wind up your shirt, the distant sound of Jenkins singing something suspiciously off-key about dolphins. But today, you're thrown for a loop, because today, the wreck is missing, gone, vanished, not a trace of dampness in sight. You freeze mid-step, staring at the blank spot on the rail where it usually hangs. For a brief, surreal moment, you think, did someone steal it? But who would do such a thing? Who could possibly be that desperate? Thomas strolls by, sees the expression on your face, and knows instantly. Yep, he says, "Wreck's gone. Again. You ask, horrified. "Oh, aye." He replies, "This happens now and then. Big wave probably took it, or Jenkins forgot to tie it off last night." You suspect it was Jenkins. Now what? You asked. Thomas sighs. Now we enter the reckless hours. It sounds ominous, and it is. Without the tow rag, the crew is left with alternatives, not good ones. You see Jenkins shuffling around with a piece of burlap. Another sailor is trying to soften up a handful of rope fibers by chewing them. You decide to wait it out, but not everyone can. Soon, a team is assembled to craft a replacement. You're told this is a secret duty, known informally as the sewing of the new wife. Down in the hold, a few of you gather around a worn crate filled with fabric scraps. There's nothing luxurious, no fine linens or cotton sheets. It's mostly canvas, old sleeves, and something that might have once been part of a sail but now smells like vinegar and shame. Choose wisely, Thomas says, holding up a patch of itchy wool. This will define our next week. Someone selects a strip of shirt from a sailor who jumped ship 3 ports ago. Another finds an old mitten. In the end, it's a Frankenstein creation. Half shirt, part sail, stitched together with wax thread and a touch of desperation. You hold it up. It flutters limply. No one says anything, but you all nod. It's acceptable. The new rag is ceremoniously tied to the rope, not with a nod, but with a double notice statement of intent, of commitment. You say a few words, nothing fancy, just something like, "Well, let's hope this one lasts more than a day." Later, as you give it a try for the first time, it feels to you, say decent, not soft, exactly, but functional, a little scratchy, but after days of salt-stiffened rags and seaweed, scratchy feels luxurious. Not bad. Jenkins says as he takes his turn. You nod. A new chapter begins. This rag, this humble assembly of fabric cast-offs, becomes part of your daily life, and with it, a whole new wave of nicknames and rituals. You call it Patchy, someone else insists it be named Sir Wipesila. The name or rages for a day before everyone forgets and just starts calling it the new one. Meanwhile, historians continue to argue whether sailors standardized these cloth swabs or just improvised on the fly. Some ships, they believe, had official replacement procedures, with junior officers keeping a stash of materials for when disaster struck. Others relied on creativity, desperation, and group consensus. In your case, it's definitely the latter. One evening, Thomas tells a story about a ship that lost its right mid-battle. They were halfway through firing the cannons. He says, when someone shouted they dropped the tow rag overboard. You ask what they did. He grins. They raised a sail, tied a hole in the middle, and called it a day. Took 6 men to hold it steady. Legendary stuff. So you see, even amidst powder smoke and cannonballs, hygiene remained if not a priority, at least a concern. And there's something oddly inspiring about that. You've now seen a ship endure storms, biscuit shortages, and rag disasters. You've seen sailors adapt, joke, invent, and share. And each time, it's the smallest things rope, the rag, the laugh over a bucket that hold everything together. As you lie back in your hammock that night, swaying gently with the tide, you think it's not the cloth itself that matters. It's the effort, the teamwork, the unspoken pact that says, we're in this together, even if it smells terrible. And that's kind of beautiful. By this point, you've gotten comfortable enough to joke about it. The rag, the cold wind, the way Jenkins always seems to be whistling Greensleeves. At the worst possible moments, it's all just part of life now. Like waves, or boredom, or biscuits that could double as throwing weapons. But today, things take a turn for the innovative. It starts with a new recruit. Ian, too clean, probably thinks this whole tow rack thing is just some sailor's prank, like the left-handed anchor wrench with a bucket of steam. But he's not joking. He shows up with a sponge. Yes, a real one, natural sea sponge, squishy and yellowish and shaped like something you'd expect to find in a 19th century bathhouse. Everyone stares at it like he's holding a royal scepter. Got it from port, he says proudly. Traders said the Greeks used them. You blink. Jenkins coughs. Thomas mutters something about spoiled landfolk, but then someone says, wait, did the Greeks use them? You think back, you have read something like that, and, well, it turns out he's not wrong. In ancient times, especially around the Mediterranean, folks did in fact use sea sponges for personal hygiene. The Greeks soaked them in vinegar or salt water. The Romans went even further, attaching the sponge to a stick. It was called the tersorium. Honestly, classy, in a terrifying sort of way. So this recruit, whether by luck or scholarship, has just brought classical sanitation back into vogue. He's very smug about it. The rest of the crew, naturally, begins to whisper. There are factions forming now. Team Sponge versus Team Rag. Team Sponge claims their method is softer, more effective, and leaves you feeling less like a barnacle. Team Rag argues it's traditional, time-tested, and doesn't squish weirdly when you sit down. The debate gets so heated that someone actually carves a tally board into the wall next to the mess. Votes are cast, demonstrations are held. Jenkins nearly starts a petition. Thomas offers to host a wiping trial but is quickly overruled. One evening, the captain catches wind of it. He calls the crew together and gives a brief but firm address. There will be no sponge cults, no wreck riots. Use what works, wiping teas. And just like that, the tension vanishes, mostly, but it gets you thinking. This sponge idea, it's not entirely bad. In fact, you find yourself wondering what other ships used, especially in places where cloth wasn't always easy to come by. In parts of the Caribbean, for example, some sailors reportedly used handfuls of soft moss or even coconut husks, thought that sounds more exfoliating than hygienic. In colder regions, moss and snow are common for land-based folk. In China, some historical accounts describe bamboo spatulas washed and reused. In Islamic regions, water and hand-washing were the standard, with smooth stone sometimes used in arid areas. Everywhere you look, humanity found a way. And yet here you are, on a British naval vessel in the 18th century, caught in a shipwide debate over whether rags or sponges reigned supreme. Historians would probably love this moment. Crew morale unusually high due to sponge-induced philosophical awakening. They write, classical sanitation reintroduced via stubborn midshipmen. In your own quiet way, you respect it. It's not really about sponges or rags. It's about sailors trying to carve out some control, some choice, in a life dictated by tide, rank, and rations. Even this tiny act deciding what you wipe with is a rebellion of sorts. You try the sponge, just once. It's not bad. You don't become a convert, but you don't scoff anymore either. It's soft, gentle, feels slightly like wiping with a damp jellyfish, but in a sort of elegant way. You don't tell Jenkins he'd never let it go, but that night, as you sway in your hammock, you chuckle at the thought. On this floating chunk of wood, in the middle of an endless ocean, sailors are forming political alliances over wiping materials, and somehow, this makes you feel more at home than ever. Because in the weird, wet democracy of the sea, even your rear end gets a vote. The wind's picked up today, and the ship lurches like it's trying to teach you a lesson. Waves slap against the hull. The sails groan. Jenkins claims he saw a flying fish give him the stink eye. And yet, amidst the chaos, life continues. Meals are served. Decks are scrubbed. And yes, nature still calls. But today's wipe isn't what stops you. It's what follows it. See, you're standing near the bow, rag still damp in your hand, when something catches your eye. A small wooden box, wedged near the railing, curious and slightly concerned it might contain something alive. You nudge it open. Inside are notes, folded bits of paper, some curled from moisture. You pick one up. It says, in shaky handwriting, Day 41, use the good corner. Jenkins watched, very awkward. Another reads, to whoever finds this, may your aim be true and your balance better than mine. It's a rag diary, an unofficial logbook, chronicling wiping experiences. You're stunned, and then you laugh, a long, wheezing laugh that earns you strange looks from nearby crewmates. Apparently, this little box is a long-standing, quietly maintained tradition. Sailors have been jotting down their tow rag tales for years. Not for glory, not for records, just for the catharsis. Thomas walks by, sees you reading. He says, smiling, found the box. Did you? You ask how long it's been there. No one knows. He shrugs. Been passed from crew to crew. Some say it started as a complaint log. Others say it was a prank that got out of hand. Now, it's history. And oh, what a history. There are entries in all kinds of handwriting, some elegant, some barely legible. A few are in French. One is in what might be Pig Latin. Some are shortruns. Storms and wiping don't mix. Nearly lost a finger. Others are poetic. O wreck of salt and sorrow divided by you chafe me so tomorrow. You'd even spot a crude drawing of the wreck with little stick figure sailors bowing to it. It's hilarious, but it's also strangely moving. Because here, in these tiny scribbles, are the real voices of the crew, not the official orders barked from the quarterdeck, not the censored logs written for admirals back home, just the human stuff, the grumbling, the laughter, the weird sense of unity that comes from shared discomfort. You had your own day, still unsure what smells were sriracha or Jenkins stew. At least the rag doesn't lie about its intentions. You fold it neatly and tuck it into the box. The next day, it's gone, not stolen, just rotated. Jenkins says it gets passed around so everyone has a turn. Some even take it into the hammock with them and write under candlelight, like they're composing naval memoirs. Historians would probably scoff at it, but you're beginning to think it might be the most accurate record aboard, because the official ship log will tell you when storms hit, when sails tore, when the rum ration ran dry, but it won't tell you that Big Paul once tripped over the rope in front of the entire crew and declared he was swearing off wiping forever. It lasted 36 hours. It won't tell you that someone tried to tie two racks together to increase surface area and nearly got flung overboard when one came loose. It won't tell you that. Jenkins sighs. Jenkinson's drew a smiley face on the rag and said it helped lighten the mood. But the diary will. That little wooden box, tucked away by the head, holds more truth than most official histories. It's messy, it's crude, it's borderline uncreatable, but it's real, and at sea, that's worth its weight in gold. So tonight, as you settle into your hammock, you think of all those who came before you, their scribbled notes, their desperate doodles, their wish for softer cloth, and you smile. History, it turns out, doesn't always arrive on parchment and seals. Sometimes, it swings gently in the ocean breeze and waits to be remembered in a box full of toilet tales. By now, you've accepted the weird duality of life at sea. On one hand, it's grit and salt and blisters and biscuits hard enough to chip teeth. On the other, it's lullabies from the rigging, moonlight on the water, and a rag flapping like a sleepy flag in the breeze. But just when you think you've reached peak absurdity in your maritime education, Jenkins walks up and casually says, "Ever heard of the captain's wipe?" You blink, you pause, you prepare yourself emotionally. "No," you say carefully, "and I'm afraid to ask." Jenkins grins, like a man about to share forbidden treasure. It's a legend. Some say it's real, others say it's just superstition. But every few voyages, word gets around that the captain's got a secret stash, a personal, perfectly folded, never-before-used cloth kept in a cedar box, scented with cloves and orange peel. You stare. "Are you telling me the captain's got luxury toilet paper?" "I'm saying," Jenkins whispers, "he's got options." Thomas overhears and chimes in, rolling his eyes. "It's nonsense. I once served under a captain who wiped with the back page of Shakespeare and then quoted it afterward. Still, the story spreads. Within hours, the crew is buzzing. Theories abound. Someone claims they saw a box under the captain's bunk. Someone else swears they caught a whiff of lavender from the officers' quarters. It's clearly just a story, but it gets you wondering. Because when you think about it, what did captains do? They had more space, better privacy, and actual furniture. They sometimes even had access to fresh linens and extra writing supplies. So is it that hard to believe they might have kept something aside for, well, their more delicate moments? Historians still debate this kind of thing. Official records rarely mention it because, let's face it, no one wants their name forever associated with 18th century bathroom preference, but fragments in letters and journals hint at the truth. One naval wife once wrote, "He has his own cloth, and none may touch it. The boatswain says it's made of lawn." I dare not ask what that means. Lawn, either way, was a fine linen, so soft it was used for cravats and royal handkerchiefs. Another diary entry from an officer's servant reads, "Was tasked with folding the white square today. Must not confuse it with the dinner napkins again." So maybe it's not so far-fetched. You find yourself looking at the captain differently now. Every time he walks by, polished boots tapping, coat perfectly creased, you think, is that the stride of a man who's never known the scene of the salt rope? You imagine him perched daintily on his private seat, gently blotting with cloth stitched by his aunt or someone with equally delicate sensibilities. Meanwhile, you're out here playing tug-of-war with a wreck that's seen more horrors than a powder keg during a lightning storm. It's enough to make a grown sailor weep, and yet, there's a strange kind of peace in it, because whether you're wiping with royal linen or recycled sailcloth, everyone ends up at the same place, leaning against the railing, staring at the sea, wondering if anyone back home has even the faintest idea what your life looks like. The wreck binds you all. In a way, captain or cook, officers or oarsmen, no one escapes the call of nature, or the unpredictability of the wind, or the constant salt in your socks. And even if the captain does have his mythical white box, well, let him have his orange-scented moment of dignity. You've got the rag, the rope, the sea, and now a crew full of folk who've all shared the same story, if not the same corner of cloth. As the sky fades into a deep indigo, and the waves lull into a gentle hush, you laugh softly to yourself. Maybe the real treasure aboard this ship is the jokes we make about wiping, or maybe you've just inhaled too much tar fumes. Either way, you feel oddly content, because if history teaches us anything, it's this. Even in the most uncomfortable situations, humans will always find a way to bond. to joke, and to mythologize something as simple and ridiculous as a really good piece of toilet cloth. You wake up this morning to an unfamiliar sound. Silence. No Jenkins whistling, no rope squeaking in the particular way that says someone's using the rag. Just stillness, calm seas, a soft creaking from the hull, like the ship itself is half asleep. You almost forget where you are for a moment, but then your hammock groans as you swing your legs out. Your feet slap against the damp wood, and you remember you're on a ship in the middle of nowhere. You haven't eaten a vegetable in weeks, and your entire hygiene system hinges on a rag dangling from a rope over the ocean. You stretch, you yawn, you shuffle toward the bow, and there it is, the rag, still hanging, still swaying, still there for you. You give it a little nod, like greeting an old friend. It's funny how something that horrified you on day one has become part of your daily rhythm. It's not glamorous. It's not even particularly clean by modern standards, but it works. And more importantly, it connects. Because over these past weeks, you've come to realize that this ridiculous little cloth is more than a ratchet. It's a thread that runs through every story on this ship. It links you to Jenkins, to Thomas, to Little Joe, and the captain's alleged perfume wipes. It links you to sailors who've come before and those who'll follow, each with their own muttered curses and makeshift alternatives and quiet victories over a particularly scratchy patch. You think back on everything you've learned, that wrecks were shared and scrubbed and argued over, that paper was rare and sacred and sometimes poetic, even as it was destroyed, that sponges sparked revolutions, that someone once wiped with part of a treaty, that the only constant was adaptation and a willingness to laugh about the worst of it. There's a strange comfort in knowing that across centuries and oceans, from Viking longships to Polynesian canoes, people have wrestled with the same questions. What's available? What's clean enough? What'll do in a pinch? Historians might spend pages on the strategies of naval warfare, on trade routes and mutinies and grand voyages, but you will always remember this journey for what it truly was, a deeply human experience, full of awkwardness and ingenuity and weird, hilarious dignity. Tonight, as the sun sets in a soft orange blur across the horizon, the crew gathers on the deck. Someone's strumming a tune on a makeshift fiddle. Jenkins hums, off-key as ever. Thomas is telling a story about the time he swears a flying fish slapped him mid-wipe. And you just listen, because somehow, this ship this creaky, crowded, rag-sharing, biscuit-crunching vessel has become home. And that rag, that's the unsung hero. So now, sailor, you're back in your hammock. The ship rocks gently beneath you, creaking like an old lullaby. Somewhere, someone coughs, someone else mutters in their sleep. And out near the bow, the rag swings softly, catching the breeze one last time. You've been through a lot tonight, not just storms and biscuits, and Jenkins' highly questionable theories, but the full sweep of human resilience, all wrapped in a salt-crusted strip of cloth. And maybe that's the point. History isn't always about kings and battles. Sometimes, it's about the quiet routines, the shared discomfort, the things we don't write down in full logs, but remember in laughter and awkward glances. So let yourself drift now. Let the waves carry you. Let the wind hum its old tune through the sails. Let the past blur into something soft and harmless, like distant lantern light flickering across the water. You've earned this rest.